Hello, Mr. Caudill. Today, I would like to ask you a few questions about your time as a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps and an instructor at the School of Infantry. So, would you agree to answer these questions?
Yes.
All right. The first question: how did you use public speaking and the skills involved with it in those two positions?
I use public speaking quite often. There were many times that I had to give classes to students up to 400 students at a time. And then later on, when I was an anti-terrorism officer, I would have to give briefings to general officers, staff officers, and anti-terrorism awareness classes to up to 1,200 people at a time.
Well, that's a lot of people. All right. So, as a follow-up question here, how was it different in those two different positions, if at all?
The first position, I was dealing with students, so I was always the superior, and so it kind of helped um, that I knew that if I messed up, my students weren't going to know. Whereas when I was briefing staff officers and general officers, there's always that fear that you're going to say or do something that could adversely affect the outcome of the meeting.
So, when it comes to your students, um, would they already technically be considered Marines, or would they be soon to be Marines?
No, they were Marines. Yes.
Okay. So, how did you speak to your fellow Marines versus your students?
Well, at first, I spoke in a superior manner as if the students were my inferiors, but after a couple of years of working there, I realized that they weren't my inferiors. So then I just started talking to everybody equally. I would talk to my privates the same way I would talk to a general. Just
Well,
you speak to them professionally and clearly and concisely because you realize that regardless of the person's rank, they have just as much of a right to your um, respect as anyone else.
so how did you use public speaking when you were in the infantry before you were a instructor?
Um, I did. I was never really good at it. When I went to school of infantry, they actually sent me to a school to. It was a college level course taught by Coastal Carolina University, um, and it um, taught us basically how to give classes and how to public speak. It's the same as taking public speaking college level courses.
Hmm, interesting. So, I know you kind of already hit on this a little bit, but I would like to ask you, how did you talk to your superiors specifically? Like, if you were giving, like, I don't know, like a briefing on a plan, or I don't know how that exactly works, but if you were talking to just them, how would you talk to them and, like that?
I would speak to them a lot like you and I are speaking now. I would make sure that I use the proper customs and courtesies that are required for certain people, and I would make sure to be as clear and concise and while speaking, and go into the conversation prepared to answer any questions. So you would basically go through a list of contingencies, like you would ask yourself these questions and what might be the possible answers um, to any other question, follow-up questions that the people you're talking to may have, so that you don't go in there blindly, and you kind of have an idea of where you want the conversation to go.
So, did you ever have to give a speech to, or around, or a presentation to your superiors?
Yes, quite often actually.
So, how exactly, what was that? Did you use notes, anything like that? How did that work,
Um,
giving a presentation to your superiors?
I use notes in the beginning, but it looks kind of unprofessional in my opinion. So the best thing that we would do is if if I had any media with it, I would set it up in my barracks room a couple nights before, and I would just practice going over it in front of a mirror. Um, that way, I didn't need the note cards. Um, And then after a while, especially when I was an anti-terrorism officer and I'm giving the same classes over and over again, you get it down pat.
You just kind of it's in your mind. You know
Right,
it. You could
right.
recite the entire thing like it was the back of your hand.
It's like you never want to read off of a slide,
Hmm.
but when you hit the certain slide comes up, you know, use that slide as a reference. You know what needs to be said to go with that slide.
All right. Did you do ever any? Did you ever do any motivational or like life lesson based speaking?
Every time I did that anti-terrorism awareness classes, I believe they were motivational. Also, when I was a substance abuse control officer, those were always motivational speeches. And every time you speak to a student, um, in a way, you hope that what you're saying is motivational, because you want them to be motivated enough to learn what you're trying to teach them. So you hope that it's motivational. I guess you really don't know until you find out how that person has actually used the knowledge that you attempted to teach them.
All right. So when it came to giving these motivational type speeches, I guess I was gonna ask who was it to, but you said it might be to students. I guess that was mostly who you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Would you keep these speeches long or succinct?
Um, I would keep them long enough. I wouldn't. The you have a problem that you tend to lose your audience if you go too long.
Okay.
You don't want it to be too short because you want to make sure that they're grasping the information, but you don't want it to be so long that they start to drone you out and their mind starts to wander. So it's just got to be that perfect balance.
So, just a real quick question: did you ever have to do any like? I guess I mean obviously you need to communicate when you were like on the battlefield and stuff like that. But did you ever have to give any like pre, you know, going in speeches or like anything like that? Like how was it talking there versus talking in a classroom?
Talking on the combat on the combat zone. Well, there's different. There's a lot of different. There's the command voice that you use. It's a very guttural, and you just have to. It's a way that you echo it through the chest. You've heard it plenty of times in the house
Mm-hmm.
when I yell. But then there were times when you just have to have a man-to-man talk with people, especially when you're expecting that person to watch your back as you throw yourself into harm's way. There are certain times when you send other people in harm's way, and then there's certain times you got to send yourself. So, but when you do that, you can't. Sometimes you just gotta be, brother to brother or sister, brother to sister or whatever with that person. You can't, just be throwing orders at them.
So you basically kind of have to try to keep everybody together when especially when you're in that command type position.
Yes, you have to.
Because you're the leader.
You have to gauge the situation and decide which form of communication would be best for the moment.
Okay. So how would you handle like a slip up or a mistake while presenting information, giving a speech, or giving instruction?
That would depend on the mistake. If I catch myself right away, I will say that, hey, I made a mistake. Here's the correct answer. If it's something relatively trivial, I will just keep going and try to hope that nobody caught me.
Kind of just like wing it and keep going.
Right. But then the only problem with that one is that if you do that, you risk the chance of somebody in the audience caught you, because just because you're giving a presentation to an audience doesn't mean that there aren't people in the audience that already know everything that you're saying. So you got to be very careful about doing that. The best is probably just to admit that you made a mistake and then move on.
Would you ever get in trouble for slipping up? I would assume that when you're giving a presentation to superiors or something like that, you might get in trouble for that.
No, actually, if you slipped up and you tried to cover it up, yes, you would get in trouble. If you slipped up, you noticed it, and you corrected yourself, you would probably actually be commended for it. Because integrity is a big part of uh, the military lifestyle. They have to know that they can depend on you. Even when you screw up, you're going to admit it.
So, what tips would you give to somebody maybe new to public speaking about how to not mess up or slip up?
Um, I would tell you that it's going to happen. You're nervous. I get that. Everybody's nervous when they speak. Just don't focus on it, and don't let it spiral yourself down. You correct yourself and you move on. Don't focus on the mistakes. You focus on the successes. And the more you focus on them, and the more that you go towards them, the more that you will have, and the fewer mistakes you will have. But don't run from your mistakes. You need to face them and correct them, or they will come to bite you in the butt later.
It definitely sounds like some sound advice. So, how did you use things like vocal variety or energy while speaking? You said you definitely had to try to keep your audience, so that sounds like something you have to do. Like you probably couldn't be talking monotone with no energy.
Right. No, you have to usually start out the conversation with a joke. Um, the type of joke is going to depend on your audience, so make sure that you're understanding your audience before you start there and tell a joke. 'Cause you don't want to tell a crude or crass joke that offends like half your audience, or makes them embarrassed or whatever. So do something to kind of lighten it up. Or if it's a professional one and you're dealing with your superiors, you may not want to go in with a joke. But you go in with something a little bit lighthearted to kind of lighten everything up a little bit. Just try to be yourself. Really, it just I don't know how to explain that one. Just do your best.
All right. So, do you, I mean, obviously this is important, but I was going to ask you, do you feel like something like that is important for your audience? And I mean, I guess the answer is obvious that it is important to have that type of stuff to make sure that everybody is attentive and into what you're saying.
Yes, and if it is possible, you need to engage your audience and have them engage you back. There needs to be some kind of dialogue if possible. It's not always possible, but I think that's another way to keep it from losing your audience's attention and having them drone off, or for you to you need to engage the audience because you need to figure out how well you're doing, and if the current direction you're trying to take the conversation in, or the public speaking engagement in, is not working on that audience, you need to know what's not working and shift to a different direction.
So how important would something like eye contact be? Because we're talking about things like vocal variety and energy. These are all public speaking skills. So how important would
eye contact is pretty important too. It's kind of off-putting to some people if you're not looking at them. Usually your superiors will understand, and in a military setting they'll understand because they know that you're nervous around them anyway, because they hold your career in their hands. But when you're dealing with your peers, or you're dealing with people below you, or if you're just dealing with a normal crowd of people, making eye contact is also a way to keep them engrossed into what you're saying. Let them know that you're speaking to them. Don't just look over them. Don't just keep staring at your slides or your note cards. Actually get in there and make eye contact. Let them know that you're speaking to that person, so that they know that there's a personal connection there, even if it's just for a few seconds.
Yeah, so you pretty much already answered my next question about the notes and eye contact. You said that you don't want to be glued to your notes the entire time, obviously,
Right.
because you want to
Um,
keep them engaged.
yeah, when
Make
you're
sure that they know you're
the
there.
first time you're giving a speech, or if this is the only time you're going to give a speech, you may need to rely on note cards, but um, don't make them your Achilles heel. You know, use them as a reference. Don't read from them. Don't read from your slides. You should already know what's on your slides. You should know what's on there. It should just be, a couple words to kind of direct your your speech in the direction you want it to go into. It shouldn't be your crutch. Don't let it be your crutch, because if you do, you'll stutter and you'll stammer. You'll do like a and all that stuff, and that tends to lose the crowd. The more you look like the that you don't know what you're doing, the less likely they are to listen to what you have to say.
All right, so final question here: did you enjoy your time like using public speaking while in your career, or was it more of just like a necessary thing? Did you enjoy it?
It can be enjoyable. It's nervous. It can be nerve wracking sometimes. It depends on your crowd. It depends on the people you're talking to. You can find enjoyment. I tend to find out that I am long winded, so sometimes I do. Like I enjoy an audience. So, um, and I think that's also um, one way to make sure that you are successful. If you enjoy doing it, you're gonna naturally make it the best you can.
All right, I think that's going to wrap us up here. Thank you for your time and your answers to our questions.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice day.